Hey guys, we are moving on into Matthew 12, and you're going to be reading verses 1 through 21 tonight. So go ahead and give it a read and see what you get from it, and come back after the pause. So all the way back in Deuteronomy, God had given a commandment to his people that just as he had rested on the seventh day of creation, they too were supposed to rest and not labor on the Sabbath day. And this was pretty much where God left the commandment at. It was relatively open-ended, I guess you would say. Later on, he did kind of offer a few subsets of this commandment, and that was because the people were trying to find ways to abuse the commandment. For instance, they had decided that they could make their laborers or the foreign person in their land work on the Sabbath day while they themselves rested, and God came back and said, no, the Sabbath is meant for all creation, whether that's the foreigner in your land, whether that's your animal, whether that's you as a native-born Israel, none of you are to work on my Sabbath. So, that was about as specific as it ended up getting. But the Pharisees, on the other hand, and the teacher of the laws, they had created something that we call the oral tradition. And so the oral tradition is this extra subset of rules that they came up with as they studied the scriptures. And they wanted it to act almost like a fence around God's law. So here you have God's law, and it's pretty specific, and it's not too much, not too many laws. But then they encircled it around with their own laws and their own traditions. And the idea was that if you kept the oral traditions that the Pharisees came up with, then you would never be at any risk of breaking God's law. And so there was this problem with it, and that was that they often took it much farther than God intended. It made the law impossible to keep, and really, in fact, it turned it into a very burdensome yoke to bear. And so at this point, we already know the Pharisees dislike Jesus. They've already had a few run-ins with him. They're already kind of on hostile terms with him. And they think that he's blaspheming by claiming to be the Messiah, by forgiving sins, by healing people. Their hearts are already as cold and as hard as stone. And so they begin to look for ways that they can trap and accuse Jesus. They just want to find him doing something wrong so that they can turn the people against him as well. And so on this particular day, they see Jesus and his disciples traveling, and it says the disciples get hungry, and so as they're walking along, they're just kind of reaching out their hands and grabbing a little bit of the wheat off the edge of the wheat fields to chew on and to satiate their hunger. And so going back into the Old Testament, God's law actually mandated that any hungry traveler was allowed to glean from the edge of the field in order to be full. And it also mandated that field owners were not allowed to cut the edges of their fields, that they had to leave those available for poor people, for orphans and widows, and for anyone that was hungry, so that there was always a way that travelers could, and people in need could have food as they went. And so all of these things were within God's law as well. All of these things were allowable. But the Pharisees are accusing Jesus and his disciples, but, just like Jesus does back on the Sermon on the Mount, where he's teaching what the heart of the law meant, he also comes here and he teaches authoritatively to the Pharisees. And he basically tells them that the Sabbath is meant for the benefit of man. It's not meant to be a burden to man. It's meant for our good, not for an additional sacrifice that's going to starve you. And if you think about it, this really is what the Pharisees were turning it into. They were basically requiring that the disciples would sacrifice even more on the Sabbath day by going hungry. And as Jesus talks to him, he's saying, you know what? I am the Lord of the Sabbath. I authored it. I am the Sabbath rest. And if we remember just from the last chapter, Jesus he says that he's come to give us a light yoke. He's come to take a burden from us. Whereas the world and whereas the Pharisees were trying to tie the people down with burdens. And so what we ultimately find about the Sabbath day, according to Jesus, is that it was given for the people to rest, not more sacrifice. And so, like I said, by demanding that the disciples would starve instead of eat on the Sabbath, the Pharisees are essentially demanding just another day where the disciples have to sacrifice. Whereas Jesus says that God desires mercy, not more sacrifice. And so the Pharisees were not showing mercy to the hungry disciples. And so to kind of drive this point home, Jesus does another example, an example through action. And he heals a man on the Sabbath, which shows an extreme deal of mercy to him. But instead of being moved, instead of being touched by the healings, the Pharisees just further harden their heart and they begin a plot to kill Jesus. Those final sections, Matthew is once again doing what we have seen him do time and time again throughout these chapters, and that is tell us through the prophets that Jesus truly is the Messiah. And so just some short application here at the end. We know what mercy is, right? Mercy is not getting what we deserve. Mercy is not receiving the punishment that we deserve or the treatment that we deserve for our actions. The Bible tells us that we sinned against God and that the just punishment for our sin should be death and separation from God. But the mercy that God showed us was sending Jesus to die on our behalf. He took our sin and he gave us his righteousness when we put our faith in him so that we can have right standing before God, and so our relationship with God can be repaired. That is the mercy that Jesus showed us. And Jesus says one of the key indicators of a believer is that they take that mercy that they've been shown and they show it to other people. Jesus says if we do not show the mercy that he has shown us to others, then we truly haven't accepted him as our Savior because we didn't understand what he's done for us. And so think about this week ways that you can show people around you mercy. You know, maybe your little brother, little sister, older sister does something to you that really is bad. Like they really do annoy you in some way or hurt you in some way or ruin something of yours or whatever. You know, that's an opportunity to show mercy. That's an opportunity not to retaliate back in an equal or even worse way, but to show them mercy. Maybe you get a chance to show a friend or a teacher or a peer mercy, but be looking out for those ways that you can show mercy to others in your day-to-day life.